Welcome. I'm Jeff Carter with Seattle City Club, and joining me also from Seattle City Club is Sara Kilisky. Hello, Sara. Um,
Hi.
Today, we will be talking as part of the Civic Bootcamp on local government and politics. We'll be talking with Washington State Senator Jamie Pedersen. Welcome, Jamie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to start with some basic questions. Why is it important to have representation of diverse and marginalized communities in local government?
Well, I'm reminded of the old saying that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. The reality for a lot of people, I've certainly experienced this for LGBTQ people, is that if you're not there to raise your issues and make sure that those issues are on the agenda, then there are likely so many other issues that people are thinking about that they're just going to be overlooked. And it isn't necessarily hostility or malice. It's just that, for us in the legislature particularly, there are literally thousands of ideas that people have every year for laws and budget provisos. And there's not time in a part-time legislature for all of those to get addressed. So it's the things that the people who are there insist on bringing to the top of the agenda that end up getting talked about and ultimately solved. And so if you're not there to press the case for your group, then it's much less likely that someone else will do it on your behalf.
And how would you say Washington state government is doing on that front in terms of representation?
We were a leader in getting to gender balance in the legislature. And certainly I think we have made a lot more progress than a lot of places have in terms of having women at the highest levels of government and in leadership positions. That's in the Supreme Court, in our congressional delegation, as our governor, leadership positions within the legislature. So I think we're doing reasonably well there. We also have done well consistently, among the largest LGBTQ delegations in the legislature of any state. So that feels like a big positive. We've done shockingly badly in terms of representation of people of color in the legislature. We'll find out here next week whether Tawana Nobles gets elected to a position in the state Senate. But it's been 10 years since there's been an African-American person in the Senate. You think about how many senators have served over that time. It's just, and the kinds of issues that we've been talking about, trying to work on, it's shocking, frankly, that we've gone that long without representation. We had a Native American person serving in the Senate, Senator John McCoy, and then he resigned earlier this year. He had some health issues. So we had gone up briefly to 2 in the legislature, and then now we're back down to 1. So that's a challenge for us. And even though, I'm hopeful that we'll pick up the seat in the 28th district, we've also just lost Representative Eric Pettigrew, who represented the 37th. So one step forward, one step back in terms of number of African-American legislators. So, a little bit better in terms of Asian representation, not great in terms of Latino representation. I would say that we have a long way to go. And as well-intentioned as many of the rest of us might be about trying to address issues of systemic racism in our laws, it's harder to do that without people at the table who are directly affected.
So along those lines, how can we increase the representation of and power of marginalized communities in government?
Well, I think there's no substitute for getting people from marginalized communities elected to the government, right? And so that really goes all the way back to the recruitment process, trying to find people who are ready to and willing to run, and then making sure that they have the resources and support to do so. Aside from Tawana Nobles, there are, I think 6 or 7 women who are running for House seats this year. You know, none of whom I think is a completely sure thing to win. And so there's been substantial efforts through a group called Opportunity PAC to get them the resources that they need to run successful campaigns. But that doesn't happen without people pitching in and supporting. You know, I'm reminded back in when referendum 74, the marriage equality campaign was on the ballot. There was an ad that probably will stick with me for the rest of my life, with a guy going door to door and asking permission to marry his loved one. And, you know, it sort of highlighted how, on the one hand, you know, how ridiculous it was that there was a state law saying that, you know, 2 people of the same sex who loved each other couldn't get married. And that, in fact, to be able to do so, people in the LGBTQ community were having to ask the permission of all of their overwhelmingly straight neighbors. But in a funny way, I think our generation is starting to realize that we're the ones who hold the keys. Like we're the ones who have to unlock these doors for people and participate in dismantling these systems that have been around for many generations before us, but of which we are the current protectors.
Sarah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll take it away. I'm going to explore the Opportunity PAC a bit more because that's really interesting to me. And I'm in the 37th district, and that's definitely a contentious race. So leading into that, so what is the state government doing right now to address equity in its policies and upcoming priorities?
So in the last budget cycle, we passed a bill that's going to create an Office of Equity within the state government. And I think a lot of us have really high hopes for that office. In particular, what I'm hoping for it to do as a legislator is to perform an analysis on every bill and on major budget items that's similar to the fiscal notes that we get about the money impact, that would do essentially an equity impact analysis for all of the policies that are proposed for us. So that if we do something that is going to have a negative effect on equity, at least we do that intentionally and not just blindly and negligently. Unfortunately, that bill and the money to fund the establishment of the office got put into a budget right as we were descending into the depths of the coronavirus mess. And so the governor vetoed the initial funding. So the bill is still on the books, but we will have to put some money into that project in the next biennial budget. And I think that there will be widespread support for doing so. But I think that is our first big step, just trying to have the tools to be able to make more informed decisions on the bills and budget items that are in front of us.
Well, thank you. I think both of those initiatives are really important and pertinent. So what can we do to ensure that our elected officials prioritize equity?
This is yet another accountability idea. I think the biggest thing you have to say is we have to somehow convince voters to care enough that when they cast their ballots, they actually vote on that basis, right? Until it becomes an issue that's important enough to the public that they press in on equity just as much as they press in on taxes or on anything else that they care a lot about, climate change. It's going to be hard to change the incentive system for the people who are elected to represent them to care. I think that said, we are fortunate in our state that we have substantial majorities of Democrats in power. And as a result, and not to make it into a partisan thing, because certainly there are well-intentioned Republicans as well. But I think in a lot of ways, this is kind of pushing on an open door, because there are many people who, if they just are educated and asked, then they will naturally want to prioritize equity in decision making. So I think that there's some consciousness raising, which we're trying to do internally within the legislature. And then the importance of having that sort of sustained push from constituents is hard to overstate.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also, like, constituents giving feedback after someone is elected and holding them accountable. So with your extensive experience as a lawyer and a legislator, how would you say laws can be used to uplift underserved and disadvantaged communities?
Well, I think the most hopeful example of that is the dramatic progress that we've made over the last 15 years on LGBTQ issues. I mean, if you go back not too far in terms of history, 1997, after 20 years of frustration in the legislature, the community decided, and Hands Off Washington, which had successfully defended against some bad ballot initiatives in the early 90s, put Initiative 677 on the November ballot, which would have banned discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity in employment. Employment only, so only one part of our law against discrimination. And the ballot measure lost in 38 out of 39 counties, including King County. And the statewide margin was 60-40 against. Now just let that sink in for a second. 23 years ago, 60% of people in Washington said that it was still okay for people to be fired for being gay. Wow. So, that didn't deter people. That following year, the forces of darkness passed the Defense of Marriage Act here in Washington and limited marriage to one man and one woman in our state. By 2006, we finally, after a 30-year fight, passed the Civil Rights Bill, amending the law against discrimination to include sexual orientation. And our progress has been, even though then later that year, the state Supreme Court said that there was no constitutional protection for marriage equality, we started our march through the legislature with domestic partnership, first in very small form, and then in larger form, and larger to everything but marriage, upheld by the voters in 2009, and then marriage equality in 2012. We amended the Parentage Act to make it fully encompassing of same-sex couples and their families in 2011, and have since passed a whole slew of bills intended to protect members of the community. So I really see that as a story of hope. I think that this next session is going to be a watershed session in terms of police accountability. And I think that is kind of the path for this dialogue between the public and the elected representatives, hopefully putting people on a path toward full equality and maybe more important, equity.
So related to what you were saying about marriage equality, as an openly gay man in the Senate, what challenges have you faced in navigating the political process to serve your constituents and also be an advocate for LGBTQ+ rights?
So, I want to acknowledge immediately that I stand on the shoulders of the people who were the real pioneers. So Cal Anderson, who was the first openly gay representative and then held my Senate seat that I have now, and Ed Murray, who succeeded Cal, and then was the first, and then was both in the House and in the Senate eventually. When I would hear stories about their time in the legislature, about people who refused to shake their hands, people who didn't want to sit next to them because they were afraid that they were going to get HIV. I mean, it was a different world. And so, you know, I think by comparison with that, the stories that I have are, you know, sort of pale. You know, that said, I remember vividly going to my first, right after I was elected that fall of 2006, going to my first retreat with the Senate, with the members of the House Democratic Caucus. And one of my fellow openly gay members, then Representative Dave Upthegrove, now County Council member, sort of shouted out, as we were having a discussion about what our priorities should be for the upcoming session, and he said, marriage equality. And there were immediately, I would say, at least 6 or 8 people who screamed, no! You know, which is, this is the House Democratic Caucus that we're talking about. We're not even talking about the Republicans. So, you know, it was a process to bring people along. And I'll just tell you 2 stories. One is about a woman who sat right in front of me on the House floor, named Tammy Green, who is a Mormon, represented a suburban district in Pierce County. And she voted against the first domestic partner bill that frankly didn't do almost anything. It just allowed people to make, you know, the same kind of things that you could do with the beneficiary designation in a will or whatever. She voted no. We had lots of teary conversations over the course of the next couple of years. And by 2012, when we passed marriage, she voted yes for marriage equality. And, you know, I think that, well, and I should say a couple weeks later, I stood in the wings of the Senate with Mary Margaret Haugen, a senator from the 10th district, Representative Whidbey Island, who she was Ed referred to as the 25th vote on marriage equality. She was the 25th person who committed and made sure that we were going to have a majority to pass marriage out of the Senate. And she walked over to me and she said, you know, Jamie, I think I didn't really ever understand this issue until I met you and your kids and your family. And now I really get it. And so I think, you know, back to where we started about being there, being present, helping people of goodwill to understand these issues and how they affect actual human beings that other legislators might care about. There's no substitute for being there and being in the process and working with these folks.
Thank you. Sarah, you want to?
Yeah, so right now, what are the critical issues in the LGBTQ community currently before the legislator or planning to be?
You know, I think we have a few issues, I would say, particularly kind of issues of intersectionality that affect members of our community. I would say that the trans community is by far the most vulnerable part of the LGBTQ community at this point. And so we are looking and thinking really carefully at policies that I think nobody has questioned for a long time, such as the criminalization of sex work, and thinking about what the disproportionate effects that those might have on members of the community. We're also looking at problems such as homelessness and thinking about that with the lens of our knowledge that a vastly disproportionate number of LGBTQ teens wind up homeless and wind up in the foster care and juvenile justice systems. And so thinking about how we can change that dynamic is important for us. I think I would be remiss not to say that large numbers of our community are also members of other marginalized communities. And so the LGBTQ community has a strong interest in addressing police accountability and reducing police violence against marginalized communities. That's certainly been on the front pages and has risen to the consciousness of people with respect to young African Americans. But you have to say that for the last 50 plus years, that has been a significant issue for our community as well. And it was trans people of color at Stonewall 51 years ago who were sort of on the front lines of what became our civil rights movement for LGBTQ people. So it's, I think it is incumbent on us when we see the ways in which our Black neighbors are disproportionately affected by a racist criminal justice system, it is incumbent on us to engage as a community, put our shoulder to the wheel to help address that systemic racism and try to create equity there.
Thank you. And yeah, the piece of intersectionality is so important. And Jeff and I were just talking about the Kunhausen Act passed this past summer. So that's definitely something for other people to look into, of how we protect trans folks better. And Jeff, take it away with some other questions.
Yeah, another question we had was that we see that you serve on a number of committees in state government, and especially the Law and Justice Committee, going back to your statement about police accountability. How does the Law and Justice Committee address police accountability and anti-Black racism in criminal justice?
Well, I would say we haven't done enough to this point. There's been some work. We obviously were involved in Initiative 940 when it came to the legislature, and worked with our colleagues on the House Public Safety Committee to try to tackle some of those issues. But I think just candidly, our response was too tepid and mild. We were trying to undo that requirement of actual malice for criminal prosecutions of police, which made Washington's system uniquely unfriendly to having any sort of criminal accountability. But I think now, over the last few months, we have come to understand that we have dozens of problems in Washington state law that we need to tackle. And those range everywhere from police tactics such as neck restraints that aren't regulated at all, let alone prohibited in our state law, no-knock warrants, to the one that I've been working on personally here over the summer has to do with the decertification system. So that's essentially the state licensing system for law enforcement officers. We literally, if an officer resigned in lieu of discipline, the Criminal Justice Training Commission literally lost all authority to take action on the officer's license or certification. And that officer could just go down the street to the next town and get hired again. So, I think we are looking at some broad and substantial reforms to that system to try to increase accountability and increase public confidence in law enforcement. We're also concerned, I think it wouldn't be surprising to me if we had a couple dozen bills in the House and the Senate on a broad range of issues around police and criminal justice. And we'll do our best to prioritize those for hearings and for getting them moved through the process. I will give the caveat, however, that this is going to be unlike last session where we were using little bleach wipes on the desk, but otherwise we're unaffected by the pandemic. In fact, there wasn't a confirmed case of coronavirus in Thurston County until the day before session ended on March 11th. This next session, the House is likely to be entirely virtual, and the Senate will be mostly virtual. And I think everybody anticipates that that's likely to have substantial effects on the volume of things that we can successfully consider during the session. But that said, I think for both the House Democratic Caucus and the Senate Democratic Caucus, police accountability and reform is one of the highest priorities for this next session. So you should expect to see, I think, some substantial improvements there.
Thank you for the work you're doing on that. And that leads me into, what are the avenues you use to hear your BIPOC constituents' concerns, especially related to this topic?
Yeah, so I'd say number one, we have publicly available emails, right? So people aren't shy at all about sending us mail. This interim has been an interim like no other, and I would say probably I have had something in the neighborhood of 700-ish sort of spontaneous emails from people on this topic of police accountability and racial equity. So that is an important avenue. Another one, of course, is the public hearing process. So we did a work session a couple weeks ago in the Senate Law and Justice Committee, 3 hours devoted entirely to these questions. In a work session, it's a little bit different because you invite the people, but we work very deliberately to structure the panels so that we centered the first nearly hour of testimony was almost exclusively family members of people who had been affected by police violence. And those were brought to us by the Coalition for Police Accountability, which is the sort of successor to De-Escalate Washington. We then also invited other folks who were racially diverse panels to talk to us about these issues. So, and then we're of course going into a session where we're going to have a public hearing process on all of these bills that are in front of us. So, you know, those are a few of the ways that we do our best. I'd say I try to be open as well to different avenues to hear from people that I haven't heard from. So I did a Facebook Live event with the Federal Way Black Collective back in, I think, June. That was a great opportunity for me to hear from a whole bunch of folks who would otherwise not necessarily be on my radar screen, not even my constituents, but obviously since I'm in charge of policy that affects the whole state, it's important for me to hear not only from people who live in the 43rd district.
Well, thank you. And our final question today, what would you say to someone who's feeling disillusioned about the system or political process, and how would you encourage them to engage and have hope that change is possible?
Well, I am super hopeful that, you know, you're going to be playing this, I think, a little while from now, so everybody will know the answer. But, you know, here we are sitting on October 28th, and within a week, I am hopeful that this absolute avalanche of voter turnout that we're seeing, you know, just unprecedented, both here and around the country, is going to lead to substantial change in Washington, D.C. and otherwise. And I think when people see that their votes make a difference, that they can actually shape who's in power, and then, you know, hopefully we'll follow through and actually do the things that that folks have campaigned on, then I think that starts to build a cycle of trust, that people who are feeling anxious, angry, frustrated, disillusioned now can start to feel like, hey, there's something to this democracy idea. And in fact, if we engage and put our voices in, we can start seeing more of the kinds of results that we would hope to see from our government. I feel really hopeful about that. You know, it's a funny dynamic with trust in any relationship. It takes years and years to build up, and then it can be destroyed in seconds, right? So it's, I don't mean to be too Pollyanna about the idea that one election is going to solve everything. It has to be a pattern of seeing a step forward in terms of who's there, and then seeing those people actually follow through on doing the work that you hope that they would do. So, you know, but I'm hopeful that we're headed in that direction.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today, Senator Pedersen. Really appreciate it. We have to also thank Alaska Airlines, our Civic Bootcamp supporting partner, for helping us put these programs on. So thanks again. Have a great day. Stay safe, and thanks for the great work that you're doing.
Thank you very much.